2 talks, rapid fire talks.
2 for price of 1.
Amazing. Thank you for coming over from U of R, just down the road from the Center for Visual Science, BCS. So a little background. Duje is actually from Croatia. Born in '76, moved to the US in '94, where he attended high school in Montana.
No, Missouri.
Missouri, MO. Sorry, I threw it for a
Yeah.
loop. I forgot mine. Yeah, MO from Missouri. Okay. Buckland, Missouri.
Population 612.
Wow. An interesting introduction. Did you know that before you came over?
It was 613 with me. So actually, I was placed in Montana in a town of 200, and I asked for them to move me, so I got upgraded to 600.
And you stayed.
I stayed, yeah.
That's nice.
I figured it could only get better.
Duje went on he persevered and ended up at Vanderbilt University, where from 2001 to 2004 he worked with Joe Lappin, got a PhD in psychology. Then from 2007 to 2013, since about 2007, you've been working over at U of R in the Center for Visual Science. I tried to come up with my summary of the work you're doing, but man, Duje has his hands in every single aspect of vision science you can imagine, and so I won't even try.
I call it scientific ADD.
There you go. But it's been a successful approach. Right now he has like 6 active grants, 4 of which are NIH R01s, which are quite large, good grants to have, so certainly it's been working. Duje is published in a lot of very prestigious journals, including Nature more than once, several times. So you have 8 active awards. I wrote that down. That's really impressive. You can publish in Nature, PNAS, Neuroscience, Journal of Vision. So
Thank you.
Formidable. Thanks for joining us.
I'm old. It really is 2 talks in one, and there are 2 very different projects. One was a complete accidental discovery that we didn't know what to do with for about 10 years. And the second one was what you think science is, where you have a big idea, you have a framework, and you test it and it works out. So one is a complete accident, and one has some foresight in it. So I think it's a nice contrast, and I'll start with an accidental one. And it's about seeing in darkness. And of course it sounds like an oxymoron, but it turns out we can actually have visual sensation in complete darkness. How did we learn this? This was about 2004. My mentor got a transcranial magnetic stimulator. This is one of those things that charges about 8,000 amps and creates a magnetic field which then induces current in your brain, and it can literally give you flashes of light if you put it in the back of your head. So if you watch the cartoons, and my kids watch cartoons now, but they're all younger than 4, but there's so much less violence these days than when I was a kid. So when I was a kid, when Tom and Jerry would beat each other up, they would see flashes of stars around their heads, and that will actually happen if you get hit in the back of your head, because your visual cortex is there. It will also happen if you stimulate the back of your head with a magnetic stimulator. So to test this, we got a new stimulator. It didn't look like this. We ordered the best blindfold we can find. It's a thing called the Mindfold, and I still use it when I travel internationally. It's a big piece of plastic. You put it on your head with some padding, and it should give you complete darkness. You can still buy it. And what happened is, this was my mentor, Randolph Blake. The first thing you do when you put on a blindfold and you want to make sure that's working, you will do this. And he said, well, I think we need to get our money back because this thing is not working. I can see my hand, even though it should be complete darkness. I put it on, I waved my hand in front of my eyes, and there's a shadow of my hand moving back and forth. And of course, when I was moving my hand in front of Randolph's hand, he didn't see anything. So the blindfold was just fine. It's just when I was moving my hand in front of my eyes in complete darkness, I had this visual sensation of some motion in front of me. And being science geek and vision geeks, we realized this is some sort of multisensory interaction that we just demonstrated. But for years, we had no idea how to measure it. I'm a scientist. I like to have more than, well, I see my hand in complete darkness, because I know I'm moving my hand. I can easily be biased to say that. So how do you put a number to it? And this is why it took us about 10 years to publish this, because for many years we were unconvinced that we had a reliable proof that what people were experiencing were true visual sensations. So I'm going to lead you to that story. And why does this matter? We have senses, but they all work together because we are experiencing the same world, and in many cases our senses work together, support each other, and they create the reality that we have around us. And in many ways, those interactions could be actually quite interesting and in some cases illusory. Here's a picture of somebody experiencing a rubber hand illusion, and how many of you are familiar with it? So it's one of those things, if you do it, it's really your ear sensation. So what happens is you have your hand here, there's a rubber hand, hence the name, and you're looking at it, you don't see your own hand. And what the experiment is doing is he's taking a little brush and brushing your hand at the same rate as he's brushing the rubber hand. And after some time, while you're feeling the sensation of the brush, you're seeing it here, it starts feeling like that hand is part of your body. You sort of get ownership of it. You know cognitively that's not your own hand, but it feels like it's your own hand. And what I do at the carnivals, the guy comes out with a hammer and it tries to smash the rubber hand, and people have this big reaction. And so here's a case where some of the sensory and the visual sensation are working together to give you a reality that this rubber hand actually feels like it's belonging to you. And it's sort of a very subjective feeling. So we know that these interactions happen, but if we were right, this was the first case when your all motion was solely sufficient to produce visual sensations for you. We ran a few questionnaires and things, and we got positive results, but it just didn't seem convincing enough. It did not seem objective enough. So we created a deception study to sort of bias people to tell us, I don't see anything at all, and see if they can still report seeing things. So this is my graduate student, Kevin Dieter, who came up with this idea. And we tricked the subjects. We gave him 2 blindfolds. One, it looked like he had some holes in it. I literally did these myself. And the other one was unaffected. In reality, both blindfolds were blocking all the light, which we confirmed. But we told subjects that this one may allow some light through. And we are interested in studying how your motion perception works at the very, very low light conditions. This is the first and probably the last time I did a deception study. So these are very common in, for example, social psychology. And what we did to our subjects is explain this task. They would sort of be looking at this, waving their hand and telling us what they perceive. First blindfold is selected by chance. They're flipped on the side. We put Post-it notes on the top and have them shuffle it around and put one on. So you as a subject, you don't know if you're getting one that's completely opaque or the one that has letting some light through. And this is what our subjects actually did. This is an actual subject just waving her hand back and forth and just trying to sort of figure out whatever sensation she might have. And this was the questionnaire. I'm not going to go through it, but we're basically asking people if they have visual motion. If they tell us yes, we ask them if they perceive direction. If they tell us yes on that, we ask them if they perceive shape. And at the very end, ask them if they really see a hand there. So we're trying to see are they giving us any subjective impression of motion. I normally don't do questionnaires, but this is sort of the best we could do at the moment. But here's a key thing. Now we are switching the blindfolds. So the subject takes one off and puts the other one on. And they may have different expectations. If on the first trial they actually saw something, they're probably thinking, I got the one with the holes. So now they're expecting to see nothing at all. So we are biasing them to experience no sensation. Because I didn't want to just ask a subject, do you see your hand in total darkness? Because me asking them maybe just bias them to tell me yes. If they didn't see anything on trial 1, they may be actually expecting to get the one with the holes and may actually report a sensation. But this is a key condition because we are biasing them not to see something. And if they're still telling me they see something, there may be a real sensation there. And then same questionnaire again. So we did 3 tasks. This is the key one, the self-motion. We also did one where the experimenter moves his hand. This is Kevin. It feels like this disembodied hand, but because we're interested in tools, we also did a kind of hand cutout as well. So here are the results. I'm plotting this a proportion of subjects. We tested 50 people, which is quite large for my types of studies. And about half of them on the first trial still told us they didn't see anything at all. So this is not something that happens for everybody. But there's a good portion that actually reported perceiving a motion with some sense of direction. So this is what we were looking for. This is trial 1. And then trial 2, you're still seeing some subjects reporting this. And critically, there is a subset of subjects that actually perceive something in both trials. Even though they're explicitly biased against seeing this. And this is because we're biasing people against saying something they're seeing it. This is a conservative estimate of how many people actually perceive motion in total darkness. To look at other conditions, so this is the one I've just shown you. So people can report seeing something called total darkness. If the experimenter moves his hand on the first trial, literally nobody said they're seeing something, so they're not really just telling us what we want to hear. And in object motion condition, it was few reports, but less than in this one. We had this result, I think, in 2008, and I didn't like it. It was still very subjective. I like math, I like numbers. It just questionnaires just didn't seem to cut it. But what do we have at this point? We really have a condition when somebody is blending senses. They're blending the kinesthetic sense of moving their hands through the air and having a visual sensation. And why would somebody experience that? Well, our brains are very good at predicting the input. Our world around us is structured, it's reliable, there are a lot of patterns. I like to think of a brain as a pattern picking machine. Really what our brains do is they're picking up on regularities in the world and taking advantage of that. And through your lifetime, every time you move your hand in front of your eyes, you see your hand motion. Your brain picks up on that pattern and sort of fills in the blank. And if you know you're moving your hand, you can expect that visual sensation, and in some cases, the brain can actually produce that. So really, we have this sort of blending of the senses, pairing of the senses, and this got us thinking. One example where we see this is synesthesia. The most common one is that people see letters, they literally perceive colors. So somebody with synesthesia will look at these words here in the letters, and they will all be in the different colors. Used to think that's a very rare phenomenon. When I teach my undergraduate class on perception, I usually get, out of 130 students, I get 3 or 4 people that have synesthesia, maybe 1 or 2 that have a color graphing one. So these are individuals that are already characterized by the heightened blending of the senses. So we got an idea, let's test some synesthetes and see, do they perceive this differently? The first synesthete that we tested, she was working in the lab with Dave Neal, my late colleague, and she told me, like, why are you doing this? Of course I'm going to see my hand. But this is the data for the controls. So we have some portion of people that perceive seeing the motion and direction. Here are the synesthete. They're literally off the chart. So people that are already predisposed to blend their senses, and none of these synesthete had any pairing that had to include kinesthesia and vision. They were still reporting seeing even individual fingers. So we have synesthete basically telling us they can see their own fingers in total darkness. And critically, most of them are still saying this in trial 2. Even though they're expecting to see nothing at all, whatever sensation they have subjectively is strong enough to override our instructions. And okay, this was better, but we were still not happy. It was still a subjective impression. And this is where it's great to have colleagues. My graduate student presented this in our seminar, and Dave Neal, who was doing a lot of eye tracking at the time, was like, I think there's a way of showing this objectively using eye tracking. And so what do I mean? If you ever go to a doctor's office and he or she is telling you, follow my finger, they're doing that not just to be funny, is to sort of test your smooth pursuit eye movements. And to do that well, you need to have a moving object that you can latch on. It's hard to move your eye smoothly without a target to follow. So this is why the doctor doesn't tell you move your eye smoothly, the doctor tells you follow my finger. And our thinking was, if these individuals are really perceiving the hand motion, they should be able to smoothly pursue their hand motion in total darkness. And I was thinking, if that happens, then we finally have an objective proof that this sensation is not something that people are imagining, but really something that's a real visual perception. We also did visual imagery questionnaires. People vary in how good they are with coming up with visual imagery, and it doesn't predict who sees this. Just because you have good visual imagery doesn't mean you're going to see this illusion, and vice versa. So we had some evidence. People are not just imagining it, but we really wanted to have a concrete proof. So this is where David comes. Bohu, I think he did some work at IRT, now is at Google, and Lindsay is our resident synesthete, but she was also IRA at the lab. And sort of what we did, I'm going to play the movie, there's no sound on this one. We would put the head-mounted eye tracker here. Doing this in complete darkness was harder than I thought. The amount of indicator lights we had to cover, it took us weeks to make the room completely dark. Even the infrared illuminators on eye tracker, when you darken that, those are as bright as you can see them. So you get special filters to fit them off of illuminators. And what we do is we'll go in the room, darken that for about half an hour, and then all these lights will start popping up. You'll see them from computers, and then we will stay there, crawl around the floor, and put stickers on it. And it took a couple of weeks. And once we did that, we finally got it set up. We were also tracking hand position at the time, but there was too much occlusion, so we never got useful data there. So what do we get? We were first measuring a pursuit component gain. It's a measure of, as your eye is moving, how much of that motion is a smooth pursuit, and how much of that motion are the saccades. This is just an illustration. So 100% smooth pursuit gain is 100% smooth eye movements. 0 will be only saccades. And then we had 3 conditions. We didn't do a deception this time. We just asked them, do you perceive motion, do you perceive color, and so on. And we had things like, we didn't expect any color, so this was a control. So here are the results for the experimental motion condition. Virtually nobody is saying they are perceiving any of these visual qualities. So disagree almost all the answers. When we had object motion condition, we're starting to have some subjects reporting visual sensation, motion in some form. So these numbers are over the line. And in our key condition, you start getting slightly stronger reports of visual sensation, motion in some form, but not color, not hand, not fingers. So people are selective, but if you look at the error bars, there's quite a lot of individual variability. So our thinking was that those individuals that can see their own hand in complete darkness should give us smoother eye movements to the hand motion versus those that do not. So that was the hypothesis. And here are the actual data. On average, in a self-motion condition, we got smoother eye movements than in the silhouette motion and the experimental motion condition. So on average, individuals were moving their eyes more smoothly if they had their own hand to track in total darkness. It's not a dramatic difference, so we wanted to sort of unpack this some more. And we separated our subjects into those that were in the median splits, those that are not seeing anything and those that are seeing something. I wanted to see the difference in the smoothness of the eye movements. So let me just look at the first pair of bars here. The black bar or gray bar are the sort of 50% of subjects in terms of not perceiving something. And the white bar is about half of the subjects that on average report seeing something toward darkness. You can tell that the eye movements of those that are actually reporting seeing something toward darkness are much smoother than the eye movements that are not. And this only worked for visual sensation, motion, moving form, and the average of all 3. So what we have here is those individuals that tell us they see something in complete darkness, they're also moving their eyes more smoothly in pursuit of that essentially invisible object. What does it actually look like to see the raw data? So here is an average of these visual motion and form ratings. Those who don't perceive something, they have about 20% smooth pursuit. This is what it looks like. It's mostly saccades and an occasional patterns of smooth pursuit. On average, those that actually perceive something give us about 40%. So here is an eye trace that has about 40% smooth pursuit. You can see there's still a lot of saccades, but you see set periods of smooth pursuit. So there's a pretty dramatic difference between these two. Here is another subject. Who do you think this is? This is a synesthete. This is her eye tracking in complete darkness of her own hand. This is her eye tracking with lights on with her own hand. There's really no difference between. So this is a person who reports seeing her individual fingers in complete darkness, and is able to smoothly pursue that essentially invisible object in almost the same way as she's able to do with the hand visible.
Did you test her for being able to do smooth pursuit without an object?
It's slightly better than, yes, she participated in all the conditions. It's slightly better than a typical individual, but it's still closer to this than this. So that's a good control. I think she was also in the lab, and I think she was just better at following instructions. The data, we also had data for the physical position of the hand, so we wanted to co-register the two. And it looks like that those matched up for these subjects, but there were too many breaks in the data because of occlusion that we didn't find it usable. And so finally we got, okay, now we have somewhat convincing evidence, so we went to publish this, and it worked. So this literally took about 10 years for a study that started with an observation. Then Dave and I wrote a little grant, and we sort of start testing this, because this is really showing us an interaction between your proprioceptive kinesthetic sense and visual sense. So Dave was really interested in multisensory integration, so we sort of came up with more principal ways to figure out how those two types of signals are combined. And everything you may expect, that more reliable signal seems to be influencing the less reliable, everything comes out. But this was really the study that sort of motivated that. And the conclusions are, we published this, we got some press coverage, and then I got a bunch of emails from the people who told me we just discovered something they've already known. Many of those were from spelunkers. And apparently, if you go into caves, and if you spelunker, those people like to turn all the lights off and just hang out in a cave. And it turns out the longer you stay in complete darkness, the more vivid the sensation becomes. And I also talked to a neurologist who does visual deprivation studies, when he actually puts people in a whole week blindfolded. And by the end of the studies, he said all his subjects were seeing the hand motion. Because you have visual input, a visual cortex is not getting any input because you're completely blindfolded. So these weak signals that are coming from other sensory signals get sort of boosted, and you become sort of stronger and stronger in perceiving your own hand motion. So to me, this really just tells us that the visual system and the proprioceptive system are interacting, and this is just one way of revealing the signals. Any questions for this?
So I guess what I'm thinking is that what you're seeing is some sort of prediction,
Yeah.
right? But why is it necessary that it comes from a proprioceptive
Yeah.
feedback?
It could be the reference copy of the motor command. So we were thinking about that, because there are two. How does the brain know where your hand is? There are two sources of information. There's one that's proprioception that tells you where your hand is, but it's also motor command that drives your hand position. So in the initial version of the paper, we used proprioception on the title, and we took it out for the same reason you're asking. So we just say kinesthesis. We did do a study where we had both passive and active movement. So Dave had a rubber arm that can move you back and forth. So we had a condition where you would go back and forth on a railing, or when this rubber arm would move you back and forth. And it seems somewhat stronger when you were executing the motion, but the problem is when the rubber arm moves you, it's not entirely passive, because you're still adjusting your hand and feeling it. So we didn't feel confident. It looked like it was the sort of motor command that's driving this, and that makes sense, because you have a motor command that's then sent to both of your kinesthetic system and your visual system, which basically tells your visual system, this is going to happen. And the more you know in advance, the more predictive you can be of your environment, the better suited you may be to detect other things in the world around you. So having advanced knowledge to expect a moving hand is probably good. It's sort of one reason why you can't tickle yourself, because you know you're going to tickle yourself, and your body prepares for it, and it sort of prevents you from being tickled. Whereas if I have 3 kids under the age of 4, so there's a lot of that. And of course, when I tickle them, it just goes crazy, and they can't do it to each other. And that's because even their little brains are aware of that, and they prevent them from being tickled. So these interactions, I think, there's a lot to do with prediction. And the next talk is going to be a little more computational. We'll also talk about prediction quite a bit.
Is there any thought of using some imaging studies to understand how far down?
I fully, we talked about it. You may have a little design. I fully expect that, for example, area empty would activate to this. The problem with this, it's almost easy to predict. Area empty is the sort of the motion center of the brain. Even if you imagine motion, area empty activates. If you see pictures that imply motion, area empty activates. If you see words that depict activities that are movement-related, area empty activates. So it's really easy to activate the motion center of the brain. So we figure going through all the trouble to show something we're clearly going to find. Of course, it matters the degree. So how strong is the activation to the invisible hand versus the real hand will be the real kind of question there. And if it varies between the individuals.
So, this suggests like a really temporary shift in weightings from visual input to kinesthetic input. You're bumping up that
Yeah.
scale. Do you think that if there was some sort of diagnostic task that people did that involved cross-modal, bimodal
Yeah.
inputs? I've been sitting here trying to think of a good example and can't.
Yeah.
Some task. Do you think that if you then had them switch tasks to something that required both visual and kinesthetic input to perform well?
Maybe, because you get yourself in a different state. You get in a state where you're actually merging the signals.
Yeah,
'Cause
it's pretty
what
rare.
we really can't answer is why is there such a big individual difference?
Yeah.
There is, my spouse basically doesn't say anything at all, thinks I'm crazy, and I wave it, and I was like, that's my hand. So we really can't explain the individual differences at this point. One thing I want to show, because it's the one case when the media coverage was really accurate, so I'm going to play the video from Slate that summarizes the study in 2 minutes. Audio? Is it a program or?
I don't know. I can't promise I'll
The
fix
authors
it.
found that this eerie ability to see our hand in the dark suggests. Can you actually see in the dark? With the help of computerized eye trackers, a new cognitive study finds that at least 50% of people can see the movement of their own hand, even in the absence of all light. Through 5 experiments involving 129 people, the authors found that this eerie ability to see our hand in the dark suggests that our brain combines information from different senses to create our perceptions. And it's not as simple as just imagining your hand as it moves in front of your face. You can't get smooth eye movement that way. If there's no moving target, then your eye movements will be noticeably jerky. The ability underscores that what we normally perceive of as sight is really as much a function of our brains as our eyes.
I like that because they kind of get it all right. It just sort of never happens. This is before the fake news started. All right, so I'm going to change the gears quite a bit because this go ahead.
Excuse me, before, just a final question. Have you thought about measuring the attention even without doing the eye movement, right? I might be able to attend somewhere that my hand is moving.
So you can, yes. So clearly, when you see something, you will draw your attention because one thing we know about moving objects, they're very good at attracting your attention. So attention could be part of it that sort of magnifies the effect. You can if you shift your attention back and forth in complete darkness, you can make your eye movement slightly smoother, but nowhere near in the range we're getting. So it's not correct that you cannot move your eyes smoothly at all. You can get some brief periods of smooth. Even people have shown that auditory targets, auditory motion, you can pursue it to some degree, but never like, for example, when Lindsay showed in. And I think for me, showing synesthete being completely off the chart in this was very kind of encouraging because it tells that this is some sort of blending, it's some sort of multisensory thing. And what I like about the study, it was a really, I started with an observation and then 10 years later turned into actual paper. And I remember saying, it's like, I like this, but it's just not convincing enough. All right, so to change this again, both of the studies featured Dave Nell, who was at that time my closest collaborator when he passed away. And he was very much interested in motion and multisensory integration and computational approaches to vision. And we shared a postdoc, Osang Kwon, who's now a faculty in Korea. And this is where he approached us. And this is one of those great experiences in advisor when a student approaches the mentors and says, I have this great idea about solving the problem. And you guys have been doing the wrong thing for about 30 years. And eventually I admitted that we've been doing the wrong thing for about 30 years, not just us, but virtually all of my colleagues who studied motion perception. Describe that. So when you study motion, when you come to my lab and you want to participate in an experiment that does motion perception, this is what you're probably going to see, more likely than not. It's going to be a moving grating behind an aperture that doesn't move. So you have a motion where there's really no gross change in position. That's not what happens in the real world. If you have a moving baseball, if it flies through the wall, to the space, it's going to move, but it's also going to change position. I'm a visual psychophysicist, and in my job description is I need to isolate the thing I'm studying. And the better I'm at isolating things, the better of a psychophysicist I am. So for motion perception, we, for the years, and excludes myself and my mentors, we try to isolate motion from changes in position. So we use things like this that didn't move. We use random dots that they didn't go anywhere. They would just move briefly and then disappear, and then another one would get redrawn. People who studied the brain mechanisms of motion also didn't want things to move because they were isolated neuron that has a receptive field in a fixed area of the world. So they only wanted to show things in one part of the world, not anything that really moves. So everything, almost everything we know about motion perception, and there are exceptions, and this is your lineage, that, where the people did study real objects, but most of the sort of low-level people studied things that didn't go anywhere. And over the years, we kept discovering these weird illusions that didn't make any sense. And our postdoc basically said, if you think of motion perception not as just isolating motion, but as a problem of object tracking. You have objects around you, and you're not really trying to figure out motion and position separately. You're trying to figure out where around you the objects are. So if you think about autonomous vehicles, they're really trying to figure out where around them the objects are and where they're going in which directions. And motion and position both provide information for that. If you have a moving object that's moving to the right, that's a really good indication that the next position of the object will be to the right. So it was the argument is that it's a mistake to isolate these things. And if you consider them together, you may actually learn a lot of ways how the world works. Here's another thing we did in my lab, is the way you can actually experience motion without any change in position. So what I want you to do is just keep your eyes on the blue cross, and I'm going to cycle this movie a few times. And you should see what I call an expanding Buddha illusion. So the Buddha should be getting bigger and bigger. And this is what we call motion after effect, or the waterfall illusion, because the same thing would happen if you went to Niagara Falls and stared at the waterfall for a while and then looked at the rocks behind you. And this does show us that we can actually subjectively perceive motion without any physical change in position. So you can separate motion and position, but that doesn't mean you should. And so what happens when you put motion and position in conflict? You get a lot of different illusions. I'm going to give you a demo of the curveball illusion later. Here's the one that we call motion-induced position shift. So what I have here is a grading in the middle and then the annuals around it. And they're perfectly concentric, and they're always going to be concentric to each other. But if you put them in motion, can you see a shift? So, and what really happens is the angle is shifted in position this direction, and the center is shifted that direction. They are still, if I show you any still frame of this movie, they're perfectly concentric, but you perceive the position of moving objects as shifted ahead of their real position. So that's a well-known illusion. And there are a few more that I'm going to give you demos throughout the lecture. And we had trouble explaining these. We can characterize it, we can measure it, but we really didn't know why it was happening. You can come up with a sort of hand-waving stories, sort of prediction. If you have a motion that's going this direction, you think that the next position is going to be there, so your brain is trying to guess where the object is, for example. But an alternative way is to really think of motion not as an isolated thing, but something the brain tries to do in its effort to track object around us. So imagine that a soccer ball is flying through the air, and it's also spinning. There are many different signals you're going to get from this object. You're going to get the velocity of the object. So the outline of the ball will have a certain velocity. There's also velocity of the pattern within the ball. Because the ball is spinning, the pentagons are going to be spinning as well, and there's going to be a local velocity signal there. You can measure this directly, because if you extract velocity of the ball, that's what you get. You can't measure this directly because this velocity is added on top of that one. So what you really can measure is the combination of the two. And the local measurement of velocity here will be a function of both how fast the ball is spinning and how fast the ball is flying through the air. The ball flying through the air we're going to call velocity of all, or the object, and the pattern motion inside we're going to call velocity of the pattern. So these are sort of the two terms that I'm going to keep using throughout the lecture. So what do we do with this? So any given point in time, there is the position of the object, there's the velocity, and there's the velocity of its pattern. And in the next point of time, you're sort of trying to figure out where this object is going to be, and the past informs the future. When it comes to moving objects, where the object is at any given point in the past can tell you a lot about where it's going to go in the future. If you are checking a blind spot, you see the object motion, you can kind of predict where it's going to be in the future. And basically, a past position is a good predictor of future position. Velocity of the object is a good prediction of the velocity of the object in the future. Things don't rapidly change velocity, but it's also a good prediction of the position. This is the key part. how fast the object is moving tells you something about where it's going to be in the future. This is just the Newton's laws that we all know about. And then we can measure these things as a perceptual agents. And we can measure the combination of these two, again, because any local measurement of the spinning ball is going to have both the pattern motion and the object motion as added together. If you work out the math, it boils down to essentially being a Kalman filter. This is what GPS does since the inception. And the equations, I'm not going to go into details, but it's a very simple thing that the position of an object is a function of the past position and the actual velocity. This is just Newton. Velocity of object is a function of the past. These two terms slow things down. And we just make an assumption that on average, all the velocities in the world slow down eventually. And this seems to be the truth. And I'm going to skip that bit. And then when you work out the math and all the noise terms, the solution again becomes the Kalman filter. And if your estimate of motion is very accurate, that's going to determine your position estimate. If your estimate of position is very noisy, that will not play a factor. So you have multiple sources of information that tells you where the object is, and the brain is going to rely on the more reliable ones. So we can disturb different sources of information and see how different illusions happen. So this is the model behavior. We are just measuring, we are using the stimulus that doesn't go anywhere. We are using either a sharp envelope, which means that you're very certain about where the position of the object is, or we are using a blurred envelope, which then kind of decreases the certainty about position. So by blurring the object, we make it harder to sort of figure out where the object is. We can also put the object in your visual periphery, and our ability to localize things in periphery is worse. So we can weaken the position cues and see what happens. And what happens with the model is when the position cues are very certain. So you're looking directly at the object, and it has a sharp envelope. Any velocity that you perceive here is attributed to the pattern velocity. Basically here, what you perceive is the object itself is not moving, but a pattern is moving. And that's what the model predicts. If you start blurring the envelope or putting the object in far periphery, something interesting happens. And I'm just going to go to the large blur. So as the envelope is very blurry, so your confidence in the position information you're getting is getting lower, a few things happen. The motion-induced position shift becomes stronger. So this illusion that you perceive a moving object ahead of its actual position becomes more vivid when the position cues are uncertain. That kind of makes sense. If you have less confidence in where the object is, then other cues like its motion can bias you to perceive the object to see in either direction. So the illusion I've shown you was done with the blurry things. And it works with blurry things. If I show you sharp outlines, it wouldn't work because your brain would have a very confident information of the position. So this is the first thing that the model predicts. Also predicts that the pattern motion is decreasing because now you're attributing some of that pattern motion to the actual object motion. So the local motion signals you should be perceiving and should be getting slower and slower. And I'll show you a demo that really drives that point home. Also shows that these two are anti-correlated. So the bigger the position illusion you perceive, the slower the object is. And it's slower because some of the local motion you detect is being attributed to object actually moving, which is what causes you to misperceive the position. And finally, my favorite, you have this clear violation of classical physics. You have an object that's shifted in a position here by 1/2 degree, but it's meant to be stationary. But you still have an object that has some velocity to it. So how can an object that's moving be perceived as stationary? And it turns out we can experimentally show that you can perceive stationary objects as moving. I can't even articulate this because it's really such a clear violation. So I'll wait until I show you the experiments. Okay, so let me demonstrate this. So what I want you to do is sort of look in the center. And this is getting closer to we actually did an experiment. And one is moving up, one is moving down. Let's play, if they're stationary, you can see that they're perfectly horizontal. And when I put them in motion, you should see sort of they're misaligned. Does it work? It'll probably work better for you guys more closely. And this is what we call motion-induced position shift. This guy is shifted upwards, that guy is shifted downwards. If I were to make these envelopes sharp, the illusion would be weaker. So that's what the model predicts. Here's my favorite. This is called motion slowing. If you look at this moving object straight ahead of it, it'll feel reasonably fast. If you look away to the cross, it will slow down. And you look back at the object, it'll speed up, and it'll look back at the cross, it'll slow down. And you can do this about 5,000 times, and it'll still do the same thing. Is it doing for anybody?
Up to 5,000, yeah.
Okay. And what the model predicts, and again, at this point I haven't convinced you that we are correct, is when you're looking straight at it, this local pattern motion is being fully attributed to the motion that you're actually seeing. So 100% of it is basically going, you estimate, of the local velocity. If you look away from it, pattern motion is being attributed that the envelope itself is moving, which then shifts the objects slightly in the direction of motion. So you spent some of the local motion signals. And because you spent some of your local motion signal to shift the object, you have less to be attributed to the motion itself, and this is why it's slowed down. And you can do this in two ways. You can look away, and our periphery, essentially, it's a filter. It blurs the world. We can't read books in periphery because we don't have the high acuity there, or I can just blur it, and it works the same way. And this illusion is called peripheral slowing. So our argument is that all these illusions are related to each other, even though in literature they all have different names that are considered to be independent. So we measured this in a series of experiments. So we measured eccentricity. So further we put things in eccentricity, the less reliable the positional signals we have. And we have two envelopes, either the pillbox or Gaussian. And Gaussian is less reliable. So to measure the actual position illusion, we had a sharp envelope here and the blurry ones, and we were adjusting how much the blurry ones had to be shifted to null the effect. So we can measure that. And for the speed perception, we were just asking subjects which one is faster. And if you look at it, for me, they're moving at the same speed, but this one looks faster than that one. So we are adjusting the speed to figure out how much the things slow down. Let me go to data. So these are the predictions of the model. Here, the model is overfitting the data. We have a lot of parameters in our model, and we're fitting this data set. But after this experiment, everything is done with zero free parameters. So everything else, we're fitting the model to this experiment, and what happens next is just running the model and getting predictions. So we found that the motion-induced position shift, the further we push things in eccentricity, the stronger the illusion is. So the bigger the shift in position is, and the shift is always greater for the Gaussian envelope than for the pillbox. So this is just the illusion that I just shown you. The more certain you are in a position, the weaker this position illusion is.
Is that independent of the size of the envelope?
We haven't measured that. I think it will be, because you have that's another way of changing your certainty of the position as well. So we didn't measure the size. Everything was about 1 degree. And then motion slowing, and this is pretty remarkable. So it slows down. So you perceive the speed as about accurate if it's at 5 degrees and a pillbox envelope. Your perceived speed is basically the same as the physical speed of the object. If you go in periphery, you get a pretty considerable slowing down. The slowing down is bigger for the Gaussian envelope than for the pillbox. And the blue lines are the model. Given how many free parameters we have, it shouldn't be surprising the model fits.
So you answered Jeff's question quickly.
Yeah.
So then I started thinking, the problem would be when things start to get too
Yeah, so
big.
then you confine eccentricity and the
Yeah, so
size.
have you tried, has anyone looked at scaling these? So if you n scaled them and
That we don't, we haven't. There's been, we finished the experiments right when they passed, and then we wrote the papers, and then Osen was, so he left and he wanted to continue this at his research. But what I do, in US, when you start as a faculty, they give you less teaching load in the beginning. In Korea, when you start as a faculty, they increase your teaching load. And you have to get older to get a lower load. So I really don't, there's a lot of things we can test, but I'm waiting for Osen to be ready.
just has to become associate dean.
Yeah. And there's a sort of nice anti-correlation. The bigger the position shift, the bigger the speed change. And the idea is that these two are related. If you sort of you sort of have a limited resource of velocity. If you use that velocity to shift the object, then you sort of use up some of it, and it's going to feel slower. And it's sort of a very nice relationship between the two. We can also predict every individual subject. We can predict the full psychometric functions with the same model. So this is a bit of a test. We're overfitting this, but we are not overfitting that. So the model works quite well. And now the model is fixed, and then we're going to try to get greedy. So this conflict between motion and position. So you have a non-zero object motion, which is this black bar, and you have an object that's shifted in position, but it's fixed. So how do you reconcile these two conflicting things? Well, here's an object that's in a blurred envelope, and the pattern is moving to the right. And this predictive signal from the object velocity, from the velocity, shifts your perceived position to the right. So this is the motion-induced position shift. But just because your position signals are bad, it doesn't mean they are non-existent. So you still have this sensory signal from object position. It's a weak one, but it's still pushing you backwards. And there's going to be a point that these two balance out. And the best thing I can tell is this sort of contraption that people do to exercise. I don't know why, but this person can be running, but the bungee cord is pulling him back. And at some point, they're going to be balanced out. So you can still have the object motion, but the position signal is sort of pulling you back and keeping you in balance. So this is sort of what we think. How do we measure this? This is where the curveball illusion comes in play. Curveballs do physically curve, but that's not enough to explain the illusion. So a lot of the curveball is perceptual. And so what I want you to do is you're going to experience it now. So what you have here is a ball that's falling down vertically. It's perfectly vertical, and it has a spin that's horizontal. And what I want you to do is sort of, if you're all the way in the back, you should just imagine your fixation process here. If you look at the ball and then look away, it's going to change direction. It's going to start moving obliquely. And if you look back at the ball, it's going to look vertical. And then look away, it's going to start moving obliquely. And this is sort of what we call the curveball illusion in the field. And essentially what you have is you have two velocity signals. And here now you clearly attribute this velocity signal to the pattern motion because you can see it. If you're in periphery, this pattern motion is attributed to the object motion, which then pushes the object moving obliquely. And why would object motion be winning out? Because this is me speculating, but I'm thinking most objects we see in the world have object motion, and very few have pattern motion. Moving soccer balls and moving baseball will have pattern motion, but cars will only have an object motion. The pattern itself doesn't move. So if the brain is uncertain, like when you're using this in periphery, the pattern motion, you can think of the seams of the baseball, get attributed to moving baseball. And this is why the path of the baseball deviates from its physical path. So why is this interesting? Well, we can test our prediction of the model. So what really happens in a stimulus, so this is time 1, time 5, the stimulus is falling down in a vertical path, but there's this sort of local pattern motion that goes horizontal. And what the model predicts is over time, as the model evolves, because it's a time-based model, is that this pattern motion signal eventually shifts the position of the curveball in a direction of motion, but eventually stabilizes in a vertical way. So the position doesn't change. It's always vertical. It's shifted away in the direction of motion, but the perceived motion stays oblique. So you have an object that's falling down vertically, which means the x position stays constant, but you have a motion vector that has a non-zero x component. So you have an oblique motion of an object, but the position is always staying constant vertically. So this is the conflict, that you have a non-zero x component of the motion, but you have no change in horizontal position. So this is sort of the sorry Isaac Newton thing. And we measured this in 2 different ways. We had an object falling down, and we were asking subjects to tell us the final motion direction of the object. So this is telling us which way, when you see the illusion, it kind of moves in an oblique way. That's what we're measuring. And we also ask subjects, what's the final object position? So the object is moving between these 2 reference points, and sometimes it starts here, sometimes it starts there, and we're trying to find at which point the final position is adjusted. So we can sort of, without going into details, we're trying to measure what is your perceived object direction and what is your perceived the position of the object. And this is what the model predicts. The model predicts at the very beginning you have this shift in the object position, and then eventually the shift stabilizes, which means there's a 0 change in velocity. So if you extract velocity from change in position, just as you've done in high school physics, this change in position initially will give you a non-zero velocity signal, and then because the position stabilizes, velocity will basically go down to 0. This is a horizontal velocity. In contrast, the model predicts that the horizontal component of the object will stay at the non-zero value throughout the motion. So you have this conflict between velocity you extract from changes in position and velocity you extract directly from the motion. Here's the data. There's no fitting of the model. This is just running the model that we fit on the first experiment, and this is the human data, and there's a really remarkable consistency there. We have a stabilization of human position with perceived oblique motion, which is the curveball illusion. So you're basically saying this model that's basically a common filter object tracking model gives you the curveball illusion for free. But also people, when they think about the curveball illusion, they usually just think about the vector sum model, because you have a vertical motion going down, you have this horizontal pattern motion, and if you just sort of take the vector sum, you're going to get something obliquely. So this is sort of the conventional view, and if you play with this model and add some temporal dynamics, you can actually you can make the model do what a data does. So if you want to come up with a way we can differentiate between the two, and we came up with this weird stimulus. I'm just going to show you the stimulus. So it's actually a stimulus that doesn't move in position, but this sort of motion inside of it rotates around. And it's really hard to explain unless I show you the stimulus. Where is it? Okay, so it's fixed in space, but the actual motion is kind of going clockwise around. And then look at the fixation cross, and it should look like the object is moving in a circle, even though the position never changes. Both the vector model and our model will predict a circle, but our model predicts this weird phase shift that the vector model doesn't. So let me explain that. Oh, sorry. So right now, I'm giving you a pillbox thing with no pattern. So you should perceive this accurately. It's moving in a circle. And this one doesn't move in a circle, but it looks like it is. So look at the fixation cross, and can you tell me if they're moving in phase or out of phase? So it should look out of phase. They're physically in phase. So whenever this is moving upward, that thing is at 12 o'clock. When it's moving downward, that thing is at 6 o'clock. Here is when I added a phase shift. And these two look in phase. So what I did here is I added the phase shift until they look to me like they're looking in phase, and this is what it looks like. So our model predicts the phase shift, and it actually comes out that way. I can go through the details. Okay, so this is the stimulus is stationary, but the pattern sort of goes around clockwise, actually counterclockwise here. And the vector sum model predicts that your position is always going to be in the direction of the local motion, because that's the only signal you're considering. But you have this position signal that's kind of keeping you down. Our model predicts the phase shift. And to sort of cut it down short, I'm not going to go into details, but our data show, it's not a huge phase shift. It's about 15 degrees. But it's predicted by the model. Actually, this is the data, and the vector sum model doesn't predict. So it was really, this is one of those cases where we had a model, and then we kept thinking about different stimuli we could throw in the model, and it just keeps predicting it, and then we just got greedy, and it kind of worked. So then, notice that in all these cases, you often have an object that didn't really move, except for the curveball illusion. Then we had an object that sort of has this weird pattern. The actual physical envelope is going counterclockwise. So the object is sort of moving counterclockwise in the physical path, whereas the pattern within the object is moving in a different direction. Yeah.
I was saying,
Fine, okay, good.
Yeah.
And the model predicts that at the small eccentricity, the object should actually follow the physical pattern. True, but at some point it will actually switch direction of rotation and move in the direction of the pattern. And there's even this little weird switch at the end that the data seems to show. So what I'm going to show you, so here's the actual object. It's going counterclockwise as an object, but the pattern is going the other direction. So if you keep looking here, that's what you should see. If you keep looking further away, at some point you should see back and forth motion in a line, and then after that it should change motion direction. And this sort of slightly rounded turn should also show up. And this is where we sort of knew that this must be something, because we can predict the more complicated patterns of the perception. Did it work?
you get it to change direction.
You got to move far enough.
Yeah.
So this is my last slide. And again, I really have to quote Dave Neal, because I really have learned a lot from him by being his colleague for a few years. So the central puzzle in vision is how the brain infers properties of the world from uncertain and ambiguous sensory data. We have we have many sensory systems that have many sources of information. We shouldn't think of them as isolated things. They're all looking at the same world, and they're all getting data that in some cases is more reliable than the others. And the brain is very good at optimizing how we use that data based on their reliability. And what you get is sort of very interesting frameworks here. And I love being wrong because I still do my lab of studying Gabor patches that don't go anywhere. But I'm realizing if I really want to understand how we perceive motion, I should really think about it in this sort of more comprehensive framework. And explains all these illusions. So even the simple displays where we isolate things, we are really fooling ourselves because we're never isolating things that shouldn't be isolated. We just have this conflict between the motion signal and the position signal, which then gives us these weird illusions, but then now we have a framework that puts it all together. That's it. And I hope I'm creating the contrast between, I would say, one study was more serious than the other, but any questions?
So one of the examples people give of people who are naive about science and vision is that some people believe they can see in complete darkness.
Yeah.
So
I should have kept some of the weird emails I got.
So
Yeah.
do you think some of those people really just can't, the way you're defining it here, they can see?
Yeah, the question is what you define as seeing. We can see things that are not caused by our retinas. There's many cases where the Canisa triangle, you can see a triangle there, it's not physically there. So to me, as a vision scientist, it's not surprising I can find examples where you can see things that aren't there, but as a layperson, not. I think Gabe was telling me about an illusion that Ken did in a dark room when you have a flash of light and you move your hand. So there's very weird things we can do. And this is what I love teaching perception is I have very many tools to wake up my students and trick them in paying attention by having all these illusions.
I want to run your experiment immediately after someone spends half an hour in something like a virtual environment where their hands are displaced from their actual visual environment.
Oh, so you can get a shift.
Yeah, see, if after half an hour of really heavily weighting the visual component and down weighting the kinesthetic and proprioceptive component in VR,
change. Yeah, I never thought of that.
what happens if we then put them in?
We may be doing stuff in RT because originally we also did this with musicians, thinking if you use your hands a lot as a musician, you may have a stronger illusion. We didn't find anything. And then I talked to Matt Dye, who's now at RT, about doing this with people who use ASL, because that's one of the sort of reasons. I talk a lot with my hands. I don't know, I see this illusion very well, and I'm really not a synesthete, so I wonder if it's me not being able to stay still. So we just got our RB reapproved, and we will be redoing the study. So
Nice.
We can do
Yeah,
it.
you should throw it in
Yeah.
there.
I was just going to ask whether you tried any of these studies with monocular vision. Because it sounds like most of them are binocular.
This is all binocular. One thing we didn't do, I keep preaching that we are adding things like in the real world. Everything here was in front of our surface. Nothing was in the depth. So things would clearly, if you want to make it realistic, we should get away from a flat screen and one-dimensional stimulus. So the short answer is no, but if I'm really preaching about combining things that combine in the real world, depth information should be added to the mix.
So you use what look like random patterns. Have you tried anything like the seam on a cricket ball or a
We
curveball?
did, when university did the press release, they actually tried to do the movie with the moving bat. The guy actually drilled the baseball, put it on a drill, and tried to film it with a high definition camera, and then tried to, and it didn't work for some reason. And I think he said his wife thought he was crazy. And then he was filming the wheels on the car. He went into a lot of kind of stuff that I thought maybe.
I was just thinking about some of those shots where someone shoots
Yeah.
a knuckleball or something,
Yeah.
where there is no rotation
Yeah.
of the pattern, and how difficult it is then
Because
to
then you can then use
extract the
yeah.
position information.
And of course the baseballs do have a bit of a curve to them because of the seams.
Yeah.
But one thing we talked to some of the baseball players at the university, talked to some of the Yankees. Sometimes what I do is that they dirty up the baseball, and what it does, it changes the contrast between the seams and the ball, and it can affect the strength of illusion. So by varying that, because you can learn illusions, we can compensate for illusions. So if you know what is real path of the baseball, what is the curveball, but if you then change the contrast between the seams and the white of the baseball by making it dirty, it will change that. And apparently some of the baseball players said that they do it routinely. Of course, they didn't read our paper. They've been doing it for years.
Okay, I think let's go over a bit. So let's all thank you very much for really. And I assume there is coffee and cookies in the lobby. There is. See, it's first talk of the semester.